Welcome back to Smitty's Learning Room. Today we're going to have a look at the preliminary HSC Core 1 and we're looking at the individual determinants of health. So we'll start by having a look at where this comes from in the syllabus, and so we're looking at the focus question, what influences the health of individuals? And you can see here that when we look at students learn about, there's the determinants of health. So this lesson is just having a look at the individual factors, which are knowledge, skills, attitudes, and genetics. And so by having a look at this lesson, you're going to find out about these individual factors, and then you'll need to have a look at how these individual factors can impact an individual's health. So we'll start by having a look at, what are the determinants of health? Now, the determinants of health are the individual, the socioeconomic, the sociocultural, and environmental factors, which can have both positive and negative impacts or influences on the health of an individual or of certain populations. Now, in this video, we're just going to have a look at the individual determinants, but it's important to understand, the fact that there are these 4 different determinants of health. Now, when you look at each one of these determinants in depth, you'll be able to have a look at the positive and negative influences for each one and see how they can actually affect an individual or a population's health. We'll start by having a look at the individual determinants. Now, individual determinants or factors are those which are unique to each different person or each individual and can determine their level of health. And generally, they're categorised under these 3 categories here. So we have knowledge and skills, we have attitudes, and we have genetics. And it's these 3 factors that come under the individual determinants which can have both positive and negative effects on our health. Now, knowledge and skills is obviously influenced by our parents, our siblings, teachers, the internet, the media, and the peers. And that's what sort of generally contributes to our knowledge just in general, but also the level of skill or physical ability that we have. Now, something that's really important to remember here, and this is something that you'll hear as a theme across the preliminary and the HSC course, is that with an increased education, you're generally going to see an increase in health. So the research says that those individuals who are educated have higher levels of health. And obviously the higher level of education generally links to an even higher level of health. So when we look at this knowledge component of the individual factors, that's basically having a look at our understanding to develop protective factors or protective behaviours for ourselves to try and improve our health. And so we look at this term or this concept called health literacy. Now, health literacy is the ability to understand and interpret health information and use it to promote and maintain good health. So health literacy skills are generally skills that we learn whilst we're enrolled at school from year 7 to 10 in PDHPE programs. And so obviously someone who has higher health literacy knowledge and skills is going to have higher outcomes within their health or greater health outcomes. Now, it's interesting to note here that just because someone is extremely knowledgeable doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to take protective behaviours into account and take measures to make sure that their health is actually good. But there is that connection between having higher levels of education and higher levels of health. When we look at skills, we look at these concepts of decision-making, communicating, problem-solving, moving, interacting, and physical movement skills. So skills is not just about being a skillful athlete, it's also about being able to make effective decisions and communicate with other people. And so when we look at these skills, we can obviously understand that these skills, come from within, but are also influenced by our parents, siblings, teachers, internet, media, and peers, as well as what they contribute to knowledge. So when we look at these skills in relation to our health, obviously they help us make, if we possess these skills, they help us make positive choices in relation to our health. They help us retain relationships and deal with conflict within those relationships. And obviously those physical movement skills enable us to participate in physical activity, which is a really important part of keeping physically healthy. Now, when we look at skills in relation to what impact they have on an individual's health, generally, if you have an increased level of skills, you're going to have an increased level of empowerment. Now, remembering that term empowerment means that the individual feels as though they have the confidence to go and do something, or they feel like they have power to do something themselves without necessarily needing help from somebody else. So if we look at the fact that someone who has high level of skills, they should essentially have high levels of health. But again, just like people who have lots of knowledge doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have high levels of health. So in general, increased education and increased skills equals an increase in health outcomes and an increase in empowerment. However, there are some cases where some people who may have increased levels of education or increased levels of skills choose not to engage in healthy behaviours which are going to improve their health outcomes. Next, we move on to attitudes. Now, when we look at attitudes, there's a very strong connection between what we know and what sort of attitude we have towards something. So if we have a really strong base of health literacy, or we have a really strong knowledge or background of different health information, then obviously we're going to have a very informed opinion or attitude about health in general. So, for example, if we look at someone who has quite a wealth of knowledge around the effects of smoking on the body, both short and long term, obviously their attitude towards smoking is most likely to be a negative attitude towards that, which is obviously going to influence their health in a positive way because of their knowledge that they have, combined with their attitude, is obviously going to help them make the decision choosing not to engage in smoking and therefore improving their health outcomes. So when we look at attitudes, we also look at this aspect of self-efficacy. Now, this is the belief in our ability to be able to carry out a particular task. So if we look at the fact that, we may have a positive attitudes towards improving our physical health, and we have good levels of self-efficacy, then that means we're going to actually believe in ourselves to be able to carry out the goal of trying to improve our physical health. So the concepts here, when you look at attitudes, obviously knowledge has a very high impact on what sort of attitude we have, but also that concept of self-efficacy can also have a huge role on the attitude that we have in relation to our health. Now, if we look at the positive influences that attitudes can have on our health, we can see here that knowledge obviously plays a huge part in this. And if we have a positive attitude towards our health, individuals are more likely to seek help, and they're more likely to engage in health literacy skills and seeking out further health literacy. Now, if you look at a negative influence, so if we've got some negative attitudes towards health, generally individuals are most likely to not seek help in relation to their health, and they're most likely to be embarrassed about their health status or their health condition, or seeking help for their health. And also they generally can tend to have a lack of trust for health professionals or people who can help them towards improving their health. The third aspect of individual determinants is genetics. Now, when we look at this concept, what is genetics? Genetics are characteristics, features, or hereditary diseases that are genetically linked and are passed on within a family. So it's not just having a look at the fact, whether your parents have blue eyes, you also have blue eyes, or you have blonde hair and your father has blonde hair. It's actually got to do with the genetic makeup as well. And when we look at genetics can actually contribute to lots of different things. So if we have a look at the positive and the negative impacts of genetics on our health, you can see here with negative, when we look at genetic makeup, this can often cause diseases such as diabetes or cystic fibrosis. or can cause physical development issues, and therefore an individual may experience syndrome such as Down syndrome, where the chromosomes haven't been developed properly at birth. When we look at the positive impact that genetics can have on our health, sometimes these are generally related to physical components. And so things like body composition, so obviously, a family of runners or marathon runners are most likely, or parents who are marathon runners are most likely to have children who, have that same sort of ectomorph body composition. And that's sort of similar in line with metabolism. So sometimes metabolism can be hereditary, and that obviously has a large impact on how fast your body can process food, and obviously impacts your body size and body composition as well. Obviously, physical abilities can be passed down through genetics. So when we look at, when someone just says, oh, they're a natural, or, someone may have a father who was a good runner, and therefore the son may have got some of those genetics or those genes somewhere that makes them a good runner. Some other things that can be passed down in genetics for positive things are this aspect of life expectancy. So generally you can have a look back at your family tree and sort of see, you might see that your grandparents or your great-grandparents have lived to quite an old age. And so therefore, a higher life expectancy or a longer life expectancy is something that can be genetically passed down. And also intellectual capacity. So having a look at that intellectual capacity, if that's genetically passed on, sometimes that can have a huge impact on an individual's attitudes, but also their knowledge, because they have that lust for sort of knowledge and seeking further health literacy. So that's going to improve their health outcomes as well. It's important to understand that while we may have certain genetic traits, or our family members may suffer from certain genetic diseases, or they may be having certain body composition or certain physical abilities, that this may not actually impact the way that an individual lives, in that they may not experience these diseases, or they may not have any of these other influences as well. So when we look at genetic diseases, generally they don't follow like a really clear path, as in like, oh, my grandmother had it and my great-grandmother had it, now my mum has it, I'm going to have it. And so therefore we can't necessarily determine how susceptible an individual is going to be in relation to those diseases. And this is where things like lifestyle choices can come into play, because if an individual has a family history of, say, cancer, the individual can obviously engage in lifestyle behaviours and choices which are going to promote positive health outcomes, which decrease the risk of cancer, knowing that they may have an increased risk because of genetics. The same can be said for, say, an individual who has inherited, a lean body composition and physical abilities. Their environmental location or their sort of socioeconomic status may have an impact on whether they're actually able to engage in physical activity. And so when you have a look at that, that may actually have a negative impact on their health, that while they have these genetic traits of, physical ability, they may not actually participate in physical activity, and therefore can have a negative effect on that individual's level of health. Now, we've just had a look at the individual determinants of health here. So remembering that when you talk about things that can determine an individual's health or determine the health of a population, there obviously are those individual determinants. And when we look at individual, we look at knowledge and skills, we look at attitude and genetics. But we also have the socio-cultural, the socio-economic, and the environmental determinants. And these will be looked at in other lessons in the series.